top 10 tips OCT en glaucoma. Creo que muy, muy disfrutable. Vamos a ver el segundo turno, Andrés, ayúdame con el segundo turno, así les contamos
Bueno,
lo que se viene.
el segundo turno, el miércoles, sí, hoy a la tarde ya lo dijimos, oculoplástica. El miércoles nos tomamos un descanso, ¿sí? Para que ustedes también se tomen un respiro de todo lo que tenemos y todo el contenido, pero el jueves volvemos con todo. Se viene M6, cómo aprender rápido y de forma eficiente. Simulación virtual, tips, herramientas, va a estar espectacular. Está Ivo, está el doctor Juan Carlos Ginés, María José Montero, Pamela González Dyer, Charles Barlansing, o sea, va a estar buenísimo. Y el viernes a la tarde, esto siempre es el segundo turno, cerramos con una super charla, también un super webinar entre glaucoma y trasplante corneal. A ver, ¿a qué acuerdo llegamos? Vamos a estar con Guillermo Amezcua, Gabo Lascano, Luis Vázquez, José La Cruz, Malik Cajuc, ni más ni menos. Cómo cuidar a nuestros pacientes que necesitan un trasplante y que ya tienen glaucoma, cómo evitar que esos lentículos sufran el daño por una válvula, por el aumento de la presión. Bueno, va a ser algo bien dinámico, con mucha discusión y que va a surgir la charla a partir de un problema que vamos a plantear. Una metodología muy interesante, eso para el viernes.
Perfecto, bueno, dos cosas. Primero ya, y vieron que esto
Hola
funciona así,
muchachos.
tenemos al doctor Alejandro Lichinger con nosotros, llegó Pablito Suárez, así que estamos armando un equipo interesante para evaluar a Damien. Y tenemos a la doctora Carmen Barraquer. Me gustaría invitarla también, la doctora Carmen Barraquer, si hay algo que no necesita esa introducción, me gustaría ver si se anima a estar con nosotros, doctora, qué honor tenerla. Creo que hoy es un día muy interesante para el keratocono y su experiencia es más que bienvenida para este panel. Saludos entonces a todos. Rodolfo Martínez, un gran abrazo, ¿cómo estás? María Castelli, también a Noé, gran amigo de la casa y integrante del equipo. Saludos, Noé. Espero que todo esté bien. Alejandro, excelente lo que nos dice Alejandro Tello, que tuvo una experiencia en una publicación con Gatinel, ¿sí? Y con el doctor Galvis. Cuéntenos un poco de qué fue eso, ¿sí? Allí ya podemos preparar todo para cuando llegue Damien. La verdad que interesantísimo, todavía no ha llegado, sabíamos que tenía un día muy ocupado y nos hizo el favor de hacerse el huequito para nosotros. Síganos entonces diciéndonos un poco de dónde son. Vamos a ver si podemos ir para atrás, a todos los que están llegando ahora, que siguen sumándose. Oculoplástica para todos hoy de tarde, interesantísimo. Esto está enfocado al oftalmólogo general, no al oculoplástico, sino todas las cosas que podemos hacer, ¿sí? Con el oftalmólogo general. Estábamos hablando un poquito de medicina basada en la evidencia, y me quería ir para atrás ahora que sí que somos varios, a todos los que estén ahí, a ver, que estamos un poco quedados, ¿sí o no? Hasta los del equipo ya estamos más quedados con el tema de la foto, del hashtag en casa con OU, así que les pedimos a todos a ver lo que estén con Damien Gatinel, que se saquen una foto, la suban a redes, ¿sí? Así que hoy es un día de fiesta para toda Latinoamérica de tener a Damien Gatinel. Síganos diciendo un poco de dónde son, ¿sí? Mucha gente de Colombia hoy, qué bonito, mucha gente de
Doctor
Colombia.
Carlos Ábalos de Guadalajara, un abrazo
Sí,
grande.
le estuvimos ayer hablando, ya se viene un proyecto con Carlitos, que un fuerte abrazo, Carlos. Estamos esperando a ver para ya hacer cosas con él, está haciendo muchas cosas interesantes allá en Guadalajara en el tema de educación, Cartagena, Santiago de Chile, Bet Lara, ¿cómo estás? También siempre con nosotros, espero que muy bien. Cuernavaca, qué bonito. Julio de la Roca de Cuernavaca, un gran amigo, y quién no le gustaría hoy estar en Cuernavaca, la ciudad de la primavera eterna.
Está
La
Emilio,
verdad
Emilio
que
Torres de Suiza. Emilio, un gran saludo, gracias por acompañarnos.
Carlos Blanco, gran amigo también, ¿cómo andás, Carlitos? Qué bueno tenerte por acá. Saludos a todos. A ver si tenemos al doctor Lichinger, a ver si se anima. Ahí tenemos a Damien. Damien. Hi,
Yes.
Damien.
Hi. How are
How
you?
are you?
I'm not sure the video is working, but
No. We are sharing the screen. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen so you can share it. But your video is not working. We don't see you.
Yes, and it should work.
We can see you. There you no,
No.
your picture. We're seeing your picture.
Okay, let me try something. Now it works. Okay.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Such an honor to have you here with us. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
How are
It's
you,
nice
Damien? How's it going?
Hi, good. And are you all okay?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, all
Okay.
Thanks God. At least what we know, everything is okay, and we're already here for you.
Yes. Perfect. So you're still like, are you working, doing surgeries, or you're just like me? You are like kind of.
No, I will tell you that probably 90% of us, we're not working
Uh-huh.
in
Yeah,
Latin
just
America. Even me that
only
I'm
Just,
Mexico.
just emergencies.
There's emergency.
Okay, same here. Same here.
And
So-
you guys in Rothschild, how's everything around there?
Well, we have stopped the everything which is not urgent, and we will probably resume with kind of normal activity mid-May, but very progressively and slowly. So we are really like for everything which is like cataract surgery, refractive surgery, elusive surgery, we stopped everything since like mid-March, the middle of March.
And a lot of colleagues with COVID in the institution, or?
Oh, some people got it, yes. Many people, by the way, but fortunately, no severe form, so it's fine.
Okay, so you want to
So-
share the screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
So,
As we said, English time, 10 o'clock.
Pathophysiological. All right. This okay? Can you see the screen?
Perfect. Perfect.
All right.
Yes. Perfect.
So I hope there's no like issue with the technique and the transmission. So first, thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's one of my favorite topics. It's a bit controversial, but I hope that I will make some points and convince you about what I think about keratoconus genesis and the essence of that disease, which of course we can discuss after the presentation. So I would also like to thank my co-authors who work with me in Rothschild Foundation. You may know some of them. Some of them also work abroad, and they all have contributed to what we will share. I would like to say I have no financial interest, of course. And again, if you want to summarize my point in one slide, keratoconus, it's a bit like that movie which stated that it's all about love. In fact, sometimes it's all about rubbing, and that's really what I think keratoconus is in a nutshell. It's truly related to this habit, and I will try to make this point again during this lecture. If you want to also read more more comprehensive data and like reasoning about this, you can go to those two papers, easy to find online. I would finally also invite you to go to this website, which was built by me and one of my fellow, Dr. Mazarian, on the picture there. And we have a lot of data there, including a lot of case reports, and also a prospective study for which we show that using our approach, we can stabilize keratoconus without surgery, just by education and by treating the risk factors, not of keratoconus per se, but the risk factors of eye rubbing. So I think we all agree. I will start with things we all agree on. Most of the time you discover keratoconus by doing like regulatory examination and find that on a teenager or on a young adult, there's like a unilateral or oblique astigmatism that you find which was not there before, or the patient comes to you and say, you know, my vision is blurry in one eye. And even when you try to fit the best spectacle correction with these patients, they can complain still of some symptoms, just as you can see here, like monocular diplopia, polyplopia. And of course, this is not something they can get rid with spectacles. That's how it's usually discovered. And of course, that's topography that makes the point. The visual disturbances are due to the asymmetry, and this leads to irregular astigmatism, as shown here. And you have a difference in the refraction, which causes the image of an elementary light source smeared on the retina. Usually the smear is grossly vertical and in the upward direction. And because the retinal image is perceived as inverted by the brain, the patient will complain of like echoes, usually located in the inferior part of the image that they are looking at. So I like this test. I invert the contrast and I ask sometimes the patient to draw what they see. And most of the time they will really draw something that if you use, for example, the OPD scan, you can find by doing some wavefront acquisition, point spread function imaging. And here it's like a simulation of E, Snellen chart on retinal image. And it's really like, you see, matching what the patient is like showing. Keratoconus can be, again, diagnosed with topography, local refraction. I like it. It shows what the point is optically. It's a lot of myopia here. And within the same pupil area, the refraction varies from high myopia to mild hyperopia. That makes it really difficult to compensate with spectacles. Wavefront is usually very distorted. But what happens is that if you use contact lenses or scleral lenses, like in that case, you can neutralize most of the corneal aberration, at least the anterior part of it, and improve dramatically the retinal image so that you see here the total point spread function is very, very improved. And then therefore the retinal image improves as well. Now, the road between me and most of the keratoconus specialists may face a kind of a turn point. As most of you know, keratoconus is usually described as an unknown disease, an ectatic process due to a mixture of genetics and environmental causes, and that it can evolve spontaneously. Whereas I think, and my collaborators and an increasing part of the ophthalmic community is still small, but people who follow this or who came and visited me and observed our management, they now really get convinced that it is primarily a mechanical disease, which doesn't mean that it erases all the other dimensions, but it is primarily caused by mechanical trauma to the eye. In other words, if you remove that mechanical trauma, you get rid of keratoconus regardless of the genetics and other causes. So the classic conception that I learned when I was a student and for which I tried to make the reality like fitting these things was a classic conception which told me in books and through lectures that it was a genetic disease with environmental factors, unknown factors, eye rubbing, atopy, that all like combined in a recipe would, in some patients, give rise to what's called keratoconus, a dystrophy of unknown origin. My conception is different. I think there are, of course, environmental factors. There are also genetics that we will discuss later on. But my point is, again, that if there's no trauma on the cornea, there's no chances that the cornea deforms spontaneously, such as it does during the keratoconus evolution. And that's really the point. So when eye rubbing and the energy conveyed to the cornea exceeds the corneal resistance, in other words, what the cornea wall can uphold as a mechanical stress, then you may have a permanent corneal deformation, which I call also a warpage or a buckling, that we label keratoconus. But it's not even an ectasia, and I will describe this later for you. If you take the metro in Paris, now there's not so many people, but you may find those scenes. And as you see here, I hope the video works. There are guys who rub their eye like the left here, the right there, and the video is not edited. And that's what that guy is probably doing 10 times a day. So if you do these things many times a day, that may correspond to what I express as excessive eye rubbing. It's not that you rub your eye once or twice a day. It's someone who does it like this guy, like probably strongly. Frequency, I don't know, because it was just incidentally happening in front of me, but the duration is probably too long. And this is causing some problems to the cornea. And not only the cornea will see this also. So everything which is on this slide, I disagree with. It's not always bilateral. It's also non-inflammatory. It's not an ectasia, and it's not a protrusion. And I don't believe that the cause is unknown now. I think we pointed what was the trigger of the keratoconus process. So it's not an ectatic process, it's a primarily mechanical disease, which is caused by eye rubbing, and there are two pathways I will discuss also. The first is the mechanical one. That's the one you expect me to discuss more, the shearing, distension to the corneal lamellae, etc., etc. But when you rub your eye, not only exert a mechanical stress, you also trigger a biological pathway, and this is making the theory very compatible with all the work which has been published on the biological findings in keratoconus, including TS sample analysis, tissue analysis. Of course, there's inflammation. When you have an ankle which is sprained, there's inflammation immediately. If you have anything in the body which is like a stress mechanically, it goes with biological inflammation. Of course, there's a biological response immediately. And as you know, if you've seen me in some lectures, I'm always challenged to prove what I'm saying. It's ironic to me because everything which is admitted in the keratoconus world has never been proven. Is there a gene? There's no gene, there's no genetic kind of strict evidence of keratoconus. Is the fact that the cornea can deform spontaneously without any mechanical input has never been demonstrated. All is based on assumptions that, again, it's an ectasia, it can evolve spontaneously, caused by some unclear biochemical processes or cell-associated processes, which are never been proven either. But what I'm going to show you now is that if you reason and if you use your clinical experience and also some reasoning, some deduction, you can really not prove like mathematically the conjecture of the no rub no cone conjecture, but you can really make this looking like veridic. So it's not just a risk factor eye rubbing. I will show you this. You can rule out alternative hypothesis. The theory, the no rub no cone conjecture, explains the right versus left eye differences. It really well explains all these form first cases as well. And finally, and more importantly, it's sustained by the stabilization post-rubbing cessation. So again, it should not really be like curious to you that when something is stressed mechanically over a certain amount, threshold, then it starts to deform. This is how those women in that tribe can extend their neck by exerting like a constant pressure upward by adding rings to it. And if this like tree here, like 300 days a year is undergoing the wind in the same direction, it may respond to this stress by deforming in that direction. I think the cornea does not escape those rules, and it's the same process. What are the structural and biomechanical properties that the cornea has to respond to? The intraocular pressure on one side, atmospheric pressure here, AP, and of course, a little bit of gravity there. And those, all the combination of these forces and the basic structure of the cornea will dictate corneal topography. We know as surgeons that we can manipulate biomechanics to change the shape of the cornea. When we do femto-relaxing incision, like here in that case, what we do is we just sever some corneal fibers on a specific location on the steep axis. And this is done in 1 second now with a femtosecond laser with very regular and homogeneous cutting. And when we do these things, what happens is that immediately there's a biomechanical response. So if you damage the cornea at one area, it will respond by a shape change. And this is arcuate incision. We can also do radial keratotomy. At least when we did that, it was the same process. You make the cornea weak in some areas. It responds immediately under the forces and the reaction in a new shape. And what's interesting is this technique, intracore, which was 10 years ago introduced, has been now stopped. But the idea was that if you make intrastromal incision, which is to me a bit similar to what rubbing can do to the cornea, if you do it every day, at some point, you will sever the lamellae, you will induce no like discrete separation vertically between the lamellae, but you may induce some trauma, which will make the tissue responding in a weakening process, which eventually would lead to the cornea to, like here, bend centrally. Interestingly, here there's no thinning. It's just, again, a weakening, which causes immediately a response in terms of shape, and with the topography, you can catch it easily. If you do literature search, you will find that in most statistical studies which have looked at the risk factors or the associated factors with keratoconus, eye rubbing is probably the most risk factor, most important one. It's in fact the only significant factor in a multivariate analysis. In pediatric keratoconus, you can find in almost 100% of the patient history of eye rubbing. And in multivariate logistic analysis, again here, eye rubbing is always found as the most prevalent risk factor. If you go back even in time to one of the first classic description of the conical cornea, not yet called keratoconus, you find that in the patient that seemed to be more exposed to this disease, there were Chinese barbers who cleanses or wash the eyes of the people with an ivory or bamboo instrument shaped like a small scoop. And again, this trauma dimension was already there in the first description of keratoconus. 2 centuries later, or 1 century later, there was a new paper in the British Journal of Ophthalmology where they found that about 75% of patients were admitting that they rubbed their eye, and among those who denied it, you could find eczema, eye rubbing, skin scratching lesion, etc., etc. So the prevalence of eye rubbing, in other words, in the keratoconus population is very high. Not 100%, but it's between 75, let's say, and 90 something percent. So there's a tremendous amount of work about the role of eye rubbing in keratoconus. But the point is, to me, and we contributed to this lately because we found not only that risk factor of eye rubbing was very prevalent. This is a cornea paper, which is just published. And in this paper, not only we found that eye rubbing has odds ratio here, but the knuckle rubbing, the way that people do when they rub their eye with the knuckles, is probably even more deleterious to the cornea than pulp rubbing or other ways of rubbing, because of course the pulps of the fingers are not as strong as the knuckles. We also found, interestingly, and I will come back to this, that side sleep and prone sleep positions were like risk factor, whereas supine sleep position was a protective factor, was the only one, by the way. And the percentage of screen time, and I think it's, of course, since the pandemic, even higher than ever, is also a risk factor for keratoconus. What makes eye rubbing to me more causative than a kind of a risk factor is the fact, and it's a simple one, that it always precedes the apparition of keratoconus. This is a video shared with me by the mother of a patient, and she filmed her son when he was 10 on his birthday, and the son has today this keratoconus here, but you can see again that he rubbed his eyes for years before he developed keratoconus, and he did it probably excessively with the knuckles, the palms, and over time it created some keratoconus in the right eye and also in the left eye. And what the patient is telling me in French here is that when he rubs his eye now, he does it stronger on the right eye, whereas on the left eye, he says, I'm rubbing the inferior part of the cornea and also my orbital bone. So in other words, if he says that the trauma that it inflicts to his eye is more pronounced on the right eye, and this is to me also why the right eye is more advanced than the left eye, and those things explain the difference in the stage of keratoconus in many patients. These are patients of my clinics who show me how they rub their eye, and again, all patients, when properly interviewed, they acknowledge the things. And there is a lot of variety in the rubbing. This is just a few samples of it, but eventually, if you do it too much, and those patients had, in the end, some keratoconus. So we found that it would be interesting to see directly, if possible, what it is creating on the... Do you still hear me now? Is it still okay? Because I have
yes,
no...
perfectly.
Okay,
perfectly,
okay. Great. So the next step for us was to try to investigate the consequence of the gestures that we've just seen on the cornea and the eyeball. And we were very, very surprised by the image we found. Here you can see, and I hope the video goes, this is one of my fellow, Dr. de Bellemanière. Under the MRI, he volunteered to rub his eye, and he's not rubbing like a keratoconus patient because he doesn't have keratoconus. He just rubs his eyes like if believes people do when they rub their eye. You see, you can almost see the cornea impact zone here inferiorly, and this is the knuckles bone there. This is another view here of the same trauma. You see the knuckles here, and you see how much the globe is like pushed backward in the orbit. You see the orbital structures compressed, the optic nerve, the retina, vitreous. And as you know, probably there have been a lot of cases, not a lot, but atopy is a risk factor for retinal detachment. And it was surprising to me until I saw those images, those video images. Now I wonder why how can the retina cope with those like bad rubbing movements? This is another example here. Yes?
I have to congratulate you for those videos. They're amazing. Actually, I use them for patient education with my patients with keratoconus, and that's the only way they understand what's happening. Because if you say don't rub your eye, they don't understand it. You show this image, and people will say, "Wow, now I get it."
You're exactly right. It's really true, and it has almost convinced myself that I should stop to rub my own eye.
And it's very important. The one that is in the lower part, in the lower left part of the screen, we can see as well how the nerve is getting like a traumatic punch when you rub your eye. And you can see that the nerve is like is twisted in the picture. So it's not only the rubbing process is not only a corneal problem, but is optic nerve problem as well. We can see in that picture right there.
Yeah, you're right. And you know, glaucoma has been associated to some eye rubbing. I've read reports of IOL dislocation after rubbing. And now I understand how it can really happen if you have a loose zonula or if you had a surgical problem. This may be the extra push to put the IOL in the vitreous. So yeah, really, I didn't expect it. I didn't expect those images to be so like violent, and it's really something we should educate people beyond keratoconus, of course. Well,
very, very helpful, Damien. If you can share us this video or is like a GIF file, it would be amazing, because I think that is the as Ivo said, is the only way that we can teach our patients and show our patients the how traumatic is a rubbing eye process.
yes, what you can do is go on YouTube, and we have at least 2 videos. You can, one is 1 minute, so it's very short, and it explains the process of going in your MRI, etc. You can also cut what you want, but please then cite us and the website Defeat Keratoconus if you can. So, and we've mentioned the cornea, we've mentioned the optical nerve, the retina, but there's something also which is puzzling to me, is that in very rare, but you can find those cases sometimes, there is one iris response to eye rubbing. This is a case here. You see it's a very inferior thinning in that patient, and you see it's almost visible at the slit lamp, the thinning. If you look carefully, I took this image on purpose, of the iris of the patient. You see here there's like a grayish zone on both sides, and it's probably, to me, the consequence of repeated knuckle rubbing. The cornea may rub directly on the iris, and this is causing over time what's been published as well as iridoschisis. There are reports of keratoconus. This is the actual patient here, how he rubs. Keratoconus and iris atrophy, or iris fibers loosening, which is called iridoschisis, right? And what is important also is when people rub their eye, and we've seen that on the video, the eyeball moves, and the Bell phenomenon, probably in most patients, makes the eyeball rotated upward. So it's probably more in the inferior part of the cornea that we rub more. And this said, I believe, and I tried to investigate the Bell's phenomenon in that exact patient, and it was quite marked. So probably this is where the patient rubs here, explaining the very inferior. And remember, of course, and you all know that the cornea is closer to the iris than it is in the center. And yet, this may explain in some patients the location of the thinning. And if you followed me now, from this picture, which I show you, where risk factors are plotted, eye rubbing is not one risk factor among the others, but in fact, it is a risk factor to all the other risk factors. I mean, it's a consequence of the other risk factors. Down syndrome patient, they rub their eye because they have atopic eczema. Dry eye patient, they have also the tendency, they are more inclined to rub. Leber congenital amaurosis, to stimulate retinal phosphine. Children, babies rub their eyes, and they've been described as high risk for keratoconus. Stress, computer work, people who stress, usually they have probably more inclination also to rub their eyes. And eye rubbing is the hidden variable that is in fact the spurious variable to this pathway to keratoconus. And I shouldn't really mention this, but if you compare all risk factor, this one is really exerted directly against the cornea. And we've seen the videos before we made the video. We've read the literature, and this is very, very strong at the pressure. It's in the amount of 1,000 millimeters of mercury. People can do this for seconds, and both eyes at the same time in alternation, and all these biological consequences, not all of them, but most of them are shown there. As I told you in the first slides, there's not only a mechanical stress to the cornea, but the expression of a lot of molecules such as metalloproteinases, interleukin-6, which we speak a lot now in the COVID pathway, TNF-alpha, etc., etc. There's also a spike in the temperature, and as you know, when you rise the temperature, enzymes are more activated, and also the proteins may be more activated, and also the collagen may be more prone to deformation because of the molecule exciting atomic increase. Again, all patients have their own way to rub, and there's as many ways to rub your eyes as you can find topography variations around the same theme, eye rubbing. I think this also explains very well that it is impossible to draw a line between normal corneas and abnormal corneas. We will never be able to do that. We can also improve the segregation and refine the statements, but normal corneas, if they are rubbed too often, too strongly, they will at some point, and that's a point I don't know, and that would be a new research area, but there's a threshold beyond which they will start to deform permanently, and going through these phases of funny looking cornea, form-fruit, subclinical, until they reach the stage of obvious keratoconus. But again, there's a true inflammatory dimension in keratoconus, which is very linked to the rubbing process. And inflammation can also trigger eye rubbing. If you have atopy, local irritation, of course you will rub. Rubbing will increase inflammation. The vicious circle will ensue and make people more prone to rub their eye, etc. So there are two routes through eye rubbing, from a normal to keratoconus. The biological route I just alluded to, inflammation, collagenesis, mechanosensitivity also. When cells are sometimes compressed, they can exhibit apoptosis just because they have mechanoreceptors in their cytoplasm. And the mechanical route is complementing this. It's caused by, of course, the shearing, the heating, the fibers alterations, the extracellular matrix redistribution. But the two routes are like synergistically causing the same issue, corneal weakening, and because the cornea is under forces, the intraocular pressure, atmospheric pressure, gravity, it will respond to those forces by deforming exactly in the same way than when we did radial keratotomy or arcuate incision, it deforms immediately because of the local weakening. Don't make me wrong, I'm not, and people try sometimes to summarize or caricature what I'm saying. Again, there are genetic dimensions to keratoconus. There is also an environmental. So I'm not saying keratoconus is just eye rubbing. What I'm saying is eye rubbing is necessary, sine qua non in Latin we say, to the pathogenesis of keratoconus. And I found this analogy to really explain my point. It's like the sunburn. If you spend time outdoor, if you have a light skin, if you go at midday under the sun, you will probably have more chances to have a sunburn than if you go at night with a dark skin, etc. But what makes sunburn is not going to the beach, play tennis, it's UV light, right? If you remove the UV light, as happens when you wear clothes or when you put cream or whatever, then there's no sunburn anymore. And eye rubbing is the same. I switch from phototype to keratotype, and I'm really convinced that there are corneas which are more prone to deform under the same stress than others if the cornea is thin, and the corneal thickness is very genetically determined, then probably for the same stress, it will deform earlier than a thick cornea. There are probably differences in the collagen quality of the cornea. But my point is, even if you have a thin, soft cornea, it won't deform as what you see in the keratoconus if you don't rub your eye. That's exactly what I'm explaining. So eye rubbing is to keratoconus what UV light is to sunburn. It's not all of it, but it's the indispensable ingredient in the recipe. And I told you also that a challenging point in my lecture is that keratoconus is not an ectasia, and I will just allude to this now. If you look at the map on the left, it looks like a severe ectasia, or at least a very pronounced ectasia. If you look at the picture on the right, the cornea looks normal. And yet, this corneal profile is the exact cornea of the map, topographic map on the left. It's the same eye. So is this looking at an ectasia here? I don't think so. There's a lot of misunderstanding in corneal topography. And the problem is that we labeled keratoconus as an ectasia, probably because when we've seen that, we were thinking that this would be like a bulging area. And if you go on the internet, on websites, you will find like diagrams such as these, where keratoconus, at least for this one, for example, looks like a large protrusion. And this is really something which is not, in fact, often seen in keratoconus. It's not really an ectasia. What you see in those red or orange or yellow area is a steep zone, steeper than the other zones here. When it's steep, it just means that the local curvature is huge, is bigger. And so if you would try to make a sphere tangent or a circle in cross-section tangent to that point, this circle would have a shorter radius of curvature. That's all what it tells you. So in fact, the paradox is it's not really bulging. It's probably pushed backward more because it's steeper, at least in that example. As long as the red area is inferior, it's not protruded, it's retracted. It's the other way. That's very important. And that's really echoed by all the, and I take all my patients' corneas into photography, and it's on the Defeat Keratoconus website as well, because it's just to make that point that it's not, at least for all the mild and advanced forms, not the extreme forms maybe, but the mild to advanced form, it's not an ectasia. To prove this point, we did a study. If keratoconus is an ectasia, then during the keratoconus process, the area of the surface of the anterior and the posterior cornea must increase. Like when you inflate a balloon, the surface increases. You know, like the cosmologist says the universe is inflating, everything is pushed away, etc. It's not an isometric deformation. Whereas if you take a ping pong table tennis ball here and you press on it, you can deform it, but you agree with me that there's no change in the surface area. This is a warpage, a deformation, but it's not a kind of surface. There's no surface change. We call this isometric deformation. So we took cases of normal cornea, normal corneal topographies, elevation maps. We took also keratoconus maps, and we computed using some triangulation mathematics the surface of elementary facets there. And by adding all of them, we could calculate the surface of anterior and posterior corneal surfaces because we had the raw elevation data. So we had a control group of 8,000 eyes and a keratoconus group of 2,000 eyes. The patients were quite similar to most variables, but of course, Kmax mean pachymetry and to some ways anterior chamber depth, which was slightly higher in the keratoconus group, suggestion may be an ectatic process. But if you deform the cornea, even without any kind of ectatic true process, you can have an increase in the anterior chamber depth for reasons we'll discuss later. So these are the results here. You can see that here in the Y dimension, it's the anterior surface, blue normal, red are the cornea, and because of the high number of maps we computed, we can really see that there's no sound differences in the area of keratoconus corneas compared to normal cornea. This is for the anterior surface, and this also happens for the posterior surface. There's, of course, more curvature. This is the K, apical K in the x-axis here. But as you can see, you can have a 60K reading, a 50K reading, and yet the same kind of surface, and of course, many normal corneas. So it's not an impressive increase, and we were not the first to describe this. And Stephen Klaas, 20 years ago, published a paper in which the title says everything. At least in the conclusion, he stated that the answer to the question was no. Keratoconus is not a true ectasia, but a kind of warpage, he said, and we agree on that. What makes cornea, again, deformed is a salient combination between the weakening, which is focal, the pressure from the inside of the eye, the atmospheric pressure, the gravity, the collagen structure of the cornea, etc. But what happens is the curvature redistributes, but on average, the curvature is probably constant. That is, if you steepen there, you flatten here. And this may change slightly, at least in the center, the anterior chamber depth, but it's not really an ectatic process per se. We can keep the word ectasia because it's so popular, but it should not really, in our mind, make us believe that the keratoconus is what we think it could be, like a stretching process over time. And the other point, which is very important in my reasoning, in my logical reasoning, is the Marfan case. I worked 10 years ago in a Marfan unit, and this is where I understood probably keratoconus. You know, sometimes it's called serendipity. You look for something and you find something else. When I worked in that department, I did a lot of biomechanical measurement to those Marfan eyes, and I found using the ORA, and it has been published, that they had low CH, low CRF. And of course, there's a quite extensive literature on Marfan syndrome patients, ocular features, and you will find that those patients are myopes, usually. They have thin cornea compared to non-Marfan patients. So in other words, they have what you expect keratoconus to have. They have a weak collagen, and we know exactly the mutation here. It's not like keratoconus. There are specific mutation on the fibrillin gene, and the fibrillin enters in the composition of collagen from the cornea and the sclera and the ligaments and the vessel body. So in other words, you could quote that a Marfan patient is the globalized keratoconus. If you believe that primarily keratoconus is a genetic disease, which is just exerting its kind of damage into the cornea, not anywhere else in the body. But if it's like a bit like the Marfan syndrome, then you should find the same features as you find in the Marfan syndrome. But the main point is that in the Marfan syndrome patient, the corneas are flat, not steep and irregular. They're usually regular and flat, at least, of course, in patients who do not rub their eye. Because my point is that if you have a Marfan syndrome, it makes your keratotype exposed to keratoconus as soon as you rub. But if you don't, what happens is the opposite. The cornea gets flatter. And it's not surprising because it's exactly what happens to the aorta in some patients, unfortunately. And this is like causing sometimes a life issue. this is, it can jeopardize your existence, because again, if you have an aneurysm or an ectasia at the aorta level, you may die from it. But a globalized ectasia occurs in the Marfan eyes, not only in the cornea, but in the sclera as well. But again, it's not surprising that the cornea gets flatter, because it's just stretched by intraocular pressure evenly, homogeneously, not focally. And because it's distributed to the wall of the cornea here, to the whole entire surface, it's stretching the cornea, which probably gets flatter because its radius of curvature increases. Nothing surprising. I call this a Marfan paradox, but there's no paradox to me. It's the paradox in the light of what you believe that keratoconus could be. Because again, if the keratoconus cornea would be soft to start with, why would not it show the same features as you find in the Marfan syndrome? I've never had any sound answer to that question for people who don't believe I'm right in my theory. They just neglect it and they say, I've never published anything, but it's not, there's no need to publish it. You just use your eyes and your brain and you use the logical reasoning, and there's a paradox here that you must solve. And if you don't solve it, you must step back and say, wow, we have probably made a mistake in our understanding. And that's exactly the step I did myself like 8-10 years before, because I wouldn't find many keratoconus patients in the Marfan syndrome, but thin, flat K readings. The other point is that many people can be puzzled by finding unilateral keratoconus, and that's even more puzzling if you believe that it is a genetic, biochemically driven disease. Why would one eye be spared and the other eye would be very advanced, such as in this case? This lady is a GP, and she told me that, in fact, not spontaneously, but when I interviewed her, she admitted that she was right-handed. But because she was right-handed, she would work as a GP, you know, long hours in front of the computer and her patients with the right hand occupied by the computer mouse, whereas she would rub, even if right-handed, with the left hand, because that was the hand that was free for that. And what was even more interesting is that when I asked her, how do you sleep? She admitted that she slept on the left side predominantly. This is a very striking case and a compelling evidence of what I'm saying. And this case is graciously conveyed to me by Dr. Cordelia Chen from Singapore. And she has this case of a pair of twins here, born in 1982. And it is very interesting because one twin has nothing remarkable in the cornea. They are monozygotic, and it's been genetically proven in them that they have the same genotype. But one of the twin has right eye keratoconus. So four eyes here, same genetics, okay, but something different. And you guess what was different? In fact, one of the twin started to rub her eyes when she was like teen, mostly the right, mostly with the knuckles, and so strongly that the sister said that she would rub until the eye squeaks. And I always ask my patient, can you hear some noise when you rub your eyes? When they say yes, it's like an indicator of severity, and that's usually associated with strong, severe forms of keratoconus. And why do you rub your eye? Dr. Chan asked, and she said because it's soothing, it relieves itch, especially when I work on the computer. Again, maybe because the hand is free, she rubs one eye more than the other one. She's right-handed, and she would say she sleeps on either side. But again, that's a very compelling cases where the only difference between those four eyes living under the same environment in the same country with the same genetics is just that one of the four eye has been rubbed too much. This is another case of a so-called unilateral keratoconus. This patient came for refractive surgery evaluation, and at the first visit, we noticed an unknown keratoconus. At the first visit, the patient denied that he was rubbing, but he was in fact proven wrong by himself when he was alerted on that, and also by his mother who witnessed that she would see her son rubbing his eyes, his right eye especially, very often. And you see, it's really a true keratoconus here, and there is maybe a very, very subtle axial map deformation, but again, no thinning. You see, everything is normal on the left eye. Why that? Because the patient again rubbed his right eye. And why did he rub the right eye only? And I invite you to ask all your asymmetrical or unilateral keratoconus cases about how they sleep, and they will probably, in many cases, tell you that, wow, doctor, you're right, I sleep on my stomach and I put my head like this, and in fact, I sleep like this, I sleep like that, I sleep like this. If the right eye is the one which has the keratoconus, etc., etc. And we published this in cornea, in the cornea paper I alluded to you in some slides ago. This is also a paper we have submitted to publication, and it's under revision. We were interested in those very interesting cases of unilateral or highly asymmetrical keratoconus cases. You know, these eyes are usually used, and we used them to build some keratoconus screening scores under the assumption that if you have keratoconus in one eye and nothing in the other eye, nothing apparent on the topography, you should design a kind of a new metric, topography-based or biomechanically based metric or combined metric, to prove that both eyes have keratoconus. I don't know if it's the right approach. I've done that myself, but in fact, when we did that, especially, for example, with my colleague Alain Saad, what we found is sometimes we excluded those eyes from the interesting eyes, again, the normal eye of unilateral keratoconus patient, because we could never detect that eye. And this eye we found, and after years, the patient would come back and the eye would never progress. There were no keratoconus at all. And they were, in fact, really in a unilateral case of keratoconus, not providing interesting information. And now we understand this better, but at that time we were puzzled, but we were expecting that next year the patient would come back with keratoconus starting on the second eye, but it rarely happened. In fact, it would not happen because when patients have a very asymmetrical keratoconus, there's a good reason for that. They just rub one eye. Why that? Maybe because they sleep on it, because of many circumstances, you may ask that. They may work on the computer with one hand and rub with the other eye. Sometimes they rub one eye with the other hand, etc. You need to document this. But for explaining, again, those very interesting cases of unilateral keratoconus or highly asymmetrical keratoconus cases, we found that eye rubbing was very explaining variable, and sleeping position. So to make it short, if you sleep on the steepest, you will find that they sleep on the steepest side and they rub sometimes in the morning before they wake up, or before they are really aware that they wake up, they rub the same eye. And that's how the theory explains the unilateral keratoconus very well, whereas other theories cannot explain it. A genetic theory without a local factor, adopt that. And back to this case, that's the picture the mother sent me of the actual patient when he was sleeping, always like this, on the right eye. So compression and heat during nighttime for 7-8 hours may trigger local inflammation. And when the patient wakes up, and you have to explain to your patient that they must pay a lot of attention to the moment when they wake up, because some patients, they first rub their eye. And it's not a surprise, because if the eye is being contaminated by dust mites, by detergent, dust, etc., it might be irritated in the morning. And remember, in the morning, the cornea is swollen, so more fragile, more exposed to the detrimental effect of the rubbing. And it's not surprising that if you do this every day, after some point, it will thin and deform the cornea. This is another case of a patient coming for refractive surgery pre-op. He doesn't know he has a keratoconus yet, and we have to announce that one eye, the left, has abnormal topography, whereas the other eye is just thin, but normal. That's an example of a exposed keratotype here. Thin cornea, less resistant, like a thin shelf cannot support as many books as a thick one. And it's not, again, a protrusion here. It's a retractation downward, probably because the cornea is sagging down under the effect of inferior weakening. This is the exact same patient here. He sleeps, remember it's a left eye keratoconus. The patient sleeps on the left eye. He rubs his left eye like this. You see the thumb here. Remember the MRI videos. And yet the profile pictures of the cornea do not show ectasia, maybe a kind of a stiffening, but there's no ectasia. Again, it's just a redistribution of the curvature. This is the video of the patient chronic habit. He shows, demonstrates the way he does it. Now he's doing it for fake. When he does it, he closes his eye, but again, this is a very strong part of the finger, and the thumb can really push on the cornea with the hand. What we did is educated the patient. We asked him to stop doing that, to change his sleeping position, to put maybe not a mask, but an eye shield at night on the left eye, on both eyes maybe, and to come back later in time. And you can see that when you do this, not only the cornea doesn't change in the bad direction, but it can sometimes, in our experience, slightly improve just because of probably some epithelial remodeling. I don't know, but there's a little improvement of the topography. This is 6 months later. So this is, to me, all these pieces of evidences are solving the mystery of keratoconus. And this is how I explain keratoconus now from A to Z, from atopy to permanent deformation. And I add to this diagram night compression. So we're going to go step by step again to summarize how you can go from night compression, atopy, etc., to the permanent deformation, which is a hallmark of keratoconus. First, it starts with risk factor. We know that as dry eye, atopy, night compression, and all of these things can increase ocular surface inflammation. Night compression can also increase the heat of the ocular surface, and surface inflammation can impair the surface barrier. Heat is promoting extracellular matrix degradation and collagenase activity. The impaired surface barrier can also trigger apoptosis. All these biocellular elements can eventually reduce the amount of proteoglycans in the cornea and the microfibrils production, reducing the collagen maintenance, which will cause the thinning we see in the early stages of keratoconus and the weakening. But that's not enough. You see there's no eye rubbing there. And I agree that could be enough to go to keratoconus. But the Marfan counterexample teaches us that if the cornea is weak but not rubbed, it's going to get flatter and it's going to get probably thinner, of course, but flat, not steep. What is the missing ingredient is eye rubbing. Eye rubbing can be compulsory, can be caused by pleasurable sensation, and all the risk factors here that are listed before, dry eye, etc., surface inflammation. Eye rubbing will impair surface barrier, increase the heat, and so will contribute to the weakening. But in addition to this, it has this mechanical dimension, causing not only physical degradation, but also cellular degradation through mechanosensitive receptors. But it also causes a change in hydrostatic pressure, a redistribution of the ground substance of the cornea. The shearing forces induce fibril and fiber slippage, also a redistribution of the ground surface displacement. And when you push on the eye, it causes a transient deformation. After some cycles of transient, that is non-permanent deformation, there is a threshold which is probably specific to each patient, each cornea, beyond which the cornea starts to deform permanently. And that permanent deformation, when it reaches the stage of astigmatism, coma, etc., is sometimes causing keratoconus to be detected, but it's just a kind of tip of iceberg of a pre-existing long process where eye rubbing was playing the key role. Again, eye rubbing may explain the progressive aspect of keratoconus, all these form through subclinical suspicious. And in my consultations, I find more advanced cases of keratoconus in the male population, whereas I find more form fruits in the female population. And the way I explain it is because what do most female and what don't do most male is eye makeup removal. And this sometimes makeup removal is done very, very bluntly. This patient is showing me how she rubs her eyes when she removes her makeup. And she does it 2 times a day because she sometimes removes midday and put again makeup. This is a medical student also. She came for LASIK and she had this like non-thinned cornea, but asymmetric bow tie. And she told me that she would do this gesture many times a day. It's not a makeup related thing. And I believe that she is doing it because when I ask her, how do you sleep? She says, I sleep on my stomach and I put my head on the pillow. So please, when you will do refractive surgery evaluation in the future, when you see those asymmetric bow ties, stop thinking this is probably the expression of a genetic disease, which is keratoconus and which is not expressed yet. But if you do LASIK, it will probably become apparent. Try to believe that this could be just the topographic feature of a kind of a moderate corneal deformation, this corneal deformation being caused by a repetitive mechanical stress, which in the case of those patients is not as strong as a knuckle rubbing. Women don't rub their eye during the day most of the time because they have the makeup, but when they remove it, they can do this kind of in a blunt way. But they will use the pads of the fingers or some cotton pads. It's not as bad as using your fist as men do usually and do like that. But I've seen, of course, female with advanced keratoconus when they rub like this, and I've seen male with form first when they just do this or that or subtle rubbing. Computer work is probably a big promoter of those irregular corneas. This is an example of a computer Google search for computer vision syndrome. And the surprising thing is that the image that you can find on Google are people rubbing their eye. So eye strain leads to rubbing. Rubbing leads to corneal deformation. And depending on how many times or strong you do it, you can have nothing to severe keratoconus encompassing from first subclinical suspicious forms. When you do PRK on patient, it's usually for a good reason. This lady came to me for myopia -2, -3, and because of this right eye, I decided to do a PRK. I asked the patient, do you rub your eye? She said no at the first visit. But when I saw her, I said, okay, pay attention to how you sleep and what you do with your hands during the day. When she came for the surgery, you see, this is the surgery day here. Just before the surgery, she says, you know what? You were right. I realized I rub my right eye like this. And I think because I sleep like that. But at the first visit, she was not expecting such questions, so she had no idea. But when you alert the patient, they will notice what's wrong in their cornea. Another example of this asymmetric bow tie, I decided to do PRK in that case. And on the day of the surgery, the guy told me, you know, my right eye is deformed, I think because I sleep like this all the time. And the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is rubbing like that. Again, you've seen that case, which shows you that it may take time for a patient to develop keratoconus over time. Again, also this theory explains why keratoconus is focal. When you see OCT, high resolution OCT mapping, what is striking is that usually cornea is okay in the periphery, not okay in the center. If you do Brie-1 microscopy in those cornea, you'll find that the indices are low in the center of the cornea, but very normal in the periphery. It goes very well with the fact that it's not a kind of genetic collagen disease to start with. It's a mechanically driven disease which will be expressed in the area of the damage. And on the other hand, when the damage is not there, there's no lesion and the cornea is okay. This is explaining why the cornea of keratoconus patient gets thinner in the center, and this thinning exaggerates progressively. You know, the Renato map, which was brilliant of the thinning, was showing that the cornea change in terms of thickening progression was going non-linearly toward the periphery or toward the center because of this exact focal thing. This is a case of a child who came to me for, I think, atopy, and I was curious to see, he had papilla here, you see, and I asked him, do you rub your eye? And he says, maybe not, but I said, are you sure? He says, oh, but I don't rub my eye, but I like to do sound with my eye. I say, how do you do that? He says, I'm showing you, doctor, and I hope the sound goes, but it's very scary. And he was just 9 years old when he's coming for this atopy and keratitis on the left eye. But we asked him, of course, to stop this. And interestingly, the cornea came back to a more normal surface 3 months after he stopped this stupid movement. To finish this lecture, it would be a very interesting kind of discussion, academic discussion, and people who maybe agree with me, maybe not, and that would be okay. But what is very important is that if I'm right, it tells us that there's a dramatic way not only to take keratoconus, take care of the patient, but also maybe we can prevent keratoconus to happen. Like we can prevent a sunburn by using cream or telling patient don't go to the sun midday. Well, we built with Adrien Mazarian this website. It's a lot of work that Adrien did to put all this data online, because it's difficult for me to convince people when I have a 5-minute lecture on a podium. I'm glad you gave me it's an hour now, because it's a long reasoning and it goes against the current. So I have to struggle to justify things to me which are obvious, and I'm really surprised that I have to explain how, to me, obvious is the fact that if you rub your eye too much, it will explain keratoconus way better than all causes. And maybe I'm wrong, but we should start to eliminate this or consider this is true before we consider that I'm wrong until I've proven I'm right. But the way to prove I'm right is this. If I'm right, then when patient would stop rubbing, it should stop keratoconus to progress. And I'm very curious of knowing this myself, because I wouldn't like to be wrong. Although if I'm wrong, that's fine. I don't care. I mean, what I want is certainty. And when you stop rubbing your eye, when patients stop to do this, what we notice is not only they don't progress, but in many cases, they even improve in the same magnitude than patients who undergo cross-linking do. This is a case where I could really tell you I've done the cross-linking, and you would say, oh, good for you because you stabilized and the cornea flattened. I must tell you, I've never done any cross-linking in my life. I respect all those who do it, but because I have this conviction myself, I don't understand why I should do this. The only reason I would do it is maybe if this is the only way for me to have the patient stop rubbing his eye. But I would fight first to stop the rubbing, which is not easy, I agree. not always obtainable. But if you succeed in this, and you can do it if you are really close to your patients, you will notice things. And on the keratoconus website, Defeat Keratoconus, you'll find these online stories with now 3 and more years of follow-up, where we report more than 100 cases that we follow prospectively of patients that came to us, most of them with progressive keratoconus, and which we stabilized just by education and by prescriptions I will tell you just right now. But you see, corneal pachymetry, K readings, Kmax, best corrected visual acuity are stable over time, and we will submit these to publication soon. These are examples of difference map where we call this between ourselves the cross-linking effect, which is a severe flattening without any cross-linking, just occurring when patients stop rubbing and also change the way they sleep. This is a case example of a patient, again, a very interesting case of exposed keratotype to keratoconus on the right eye because the cornea is thin, but unilateral left eye keratoconus. This is the patient. He tells me, I use my right eye to see and my left eye to get pleasurable sensation because I love to rub my left eye. My left eye has a poor vision. I don't care. Even if you tell me it will progress more, I will rub still. We convinced that guy that he should not rub anymore and change his sleeping position, which was left eye on the left wrist. And see, he had like a 5K reading of a flattening effect 3 months just after removing the pressure of the head against the wrist at night and the rubbing during the day. You know, orthokeratology is just a way to change the corneal shape by the passive pressure of a hard, rigid contact lens. If you have the weight of your head on your cornea for 6-7 hours, this is like orthokeratology to the 4th power. And that's why it can really induce some change in the cornea. And again, we observe those changes, which are good news also because it usually goes with an improvement in the refraction. Another case of bilateral keratoconus, we ask that patients stop sleeping on the right eye, stop rubbing your right eye. And this is what happened. You see a very severe case on the right eye, but a moderate flattening, at least no progression over time. This is 6 months later, still, the flattening is still going on. No cross-linking, just the relief of rubbing and nighttime compression. 1 year later, still the same pattern. Another case, you see, and again, after rubbing cessation, 2-3 diopters of flattening on the most advanced eye, which was the eye which was compressed at night by that patient. We usually gave them eye shields, such as shown here, because it's very difficult for the patient to control what he's doing at night when he rubs his eyes at night. And that's a key point. And I like this case of a 16-year-old patient with astigmatism here. And the patient here, you see, was caught on tape in a wedding ceremony years before. Here in a stadium, he's half French, half Brazilian. And he's rubbing his eyes like this, you know, and he's doing it even on some pictures. This is another video here, you see, where he's rubbing his eyes. And that guy had keratoconus. This is the way he sleeps at night. This is how he shows it. And these are pictures taken by his parents. We gave him patches for night. We invited him, we showed him the video of the MRI, bedtime, modification of the sleep position. We treated dry eye, allergy, atopy, etc., etc. And it never progressed. The patient came slightly flatter over time. This is like you see 6 months. This is another time evolution here, but no progression and a little flattening. So for us, the point is now that we don't believe that we should always like prescribe cross-linking to our patient. What we want is suppress eye rubbing. This is making this theory not very popular because many surgeons like to do cross-linking. Okay, let's do it. But again, what my point is that I don't believe that's the logical first line therapeutics to keratoconus. I would probably emphasize on education, risk factors of eye rubbing, ocular dry eye, allergy, and again, protect the eyes at night with eye shields, ocular shields. It's very important. To me, there's ample evidence that we can prevent keratoconus through prevention of excessive eye rubbing, but that's another story, another chapter that we can open, but it would require a lot of world education. And as you know, now the world is fighting a more severe case than keratoconus, at least for the life risk. So it's not the case to alert the authorities yet, but Renato Ambrosio did this in this Violet June campaign. We try to do it in France, and I invite you to like promote this speech, even if you don't really fully agree 100% with me. I hope I've convinced you that eye rubbing, if not the key, is a very, very key player in that keratoconus genesis. This is the conclusion, and we have time for questions if you want, of course.
Yes, Damien. Well, first, thank you so much for your time. This was amazing. You know, to see a new theory develop and you have all the data to support it. I think it's incredible. Actually, I'm one of your fans. I'm in your team for sure. There's many questions. We know that you have a little amount of time, so let's try to go to them. The first one from a really good friend that he had to leave, Luis Fernandez Vega. He was asking if this is the death of cross-linking for you.
Well, if this is the death of cross-linking, that could be the death of my theory as well, because I feel that this is one kind of obstacle, indirect, that because I believe in this mechanical theory, then it logically make cross-linking looking like the non-logical thing, of course. But I would say that's a case-by-case scenario, and if you are happy with cross-linking, if you feel that it works well, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just explaining why I don't do it. I think in some cases, it may help the patient to be aware of the disease. It may help the patient also to stop to rub his eye, because you cause local nerve degradation when you do cross-linking. You kill the nerve termination endings, and then the cornea is less sensitive. So most patients would rub less, if not anymore, after cross-linking. That's a very good point. So if cross-linking is a way to stop rubbing, I'd say go for it. But before that, I would try education, ocular surface management, allergy management, etc., behavioral management, all these things.
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to ask the panel now to do the questions. I'm sure they have many. But just my last question is, so there is no rub, but you also think a lot about the inflammatory disease in the ocular surface, correct? You
Yes.
always treat that.
Yes. Of course, yeah, it's very important. It's if you tell the patient, okay, you have keratoconus because you rub your eye, bye-bye, it's very bad medicine. You need first to be very kind with them, because what I face sometimes, because I have many patients coming for second opinion. So they have been proposed cross-linking in one hospital. They go on the internet, they find my website where it's explained that it's not maybe mandatory to do it. The first thing is to stop the rubbing. They come to me and they say, what should I do? And I say, you should really focus on eye rubbing, stop, and give a chance to this before you do cross-linking maybe. And that's the way to do it. And to help the patient stop rubbing, which is very difficult in many cases, you have to go from the ocular surface, dry eye, so lubricant sometime, all the time, rinsing solutions, explain the patient he should stop to rub, explain to the patient that from the moment where he wakes up to the moment he goes to bed, he has to pay attention to this. That is, when he wakes up, be sure that he's not doing this at the first gesture of the day. When they take the shower in the morning, make sure that they don't rub their eye, because I've been exposed to patients who denied rubbing until they realized that they will rub like this under the shower for 5 minutes sometime in the morning to make them waking up. When they work in front of the computer, when they do some sports like swimming, sometimes they do a lap, then they stop, they do this, they exit the swimming pool, and they do this again under the shower for 10 minutes. When you remove your makeup, for ladies mostly, don't do things like that, but be gentle, etc. And you can tell them, and that's also what Arthur Cummings from the island territory does. He tells them, you can rub your eyes, but there's a video of him on YouTube. He says, rub like this, rub like that, but don't rub like this anymore. That's a way to control the rubbing thing. You can use cyclosporine in dry eye. You can use steroids. You can use many things. Patches at night is a good test. Sometimes the patient put the patches at night, goes to bed, and in the morning, the patches are not there. That's a good test. If they wake up with the patches taped on the eye, it means they don't exert a kind of stress on the eye. But many patients tell me, I surprise myself in the morning rubbing my shield, or the shield goes every night away. And I tell them it should not. If it does, it means you do something on your eye at night.
Andres, maybe you have to.
Thanks,
Can
Ivo.
you just stop sharing the screen so we can see each other all in the screen?
Oh yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks, Damien, for this outstanding lecture. It's amazing. I think we have learned a lot from you today, so it's amazing. My question was about topical medication. You just say that you can use cyclosporine, anti-allergic, so I really wanted to know about that in your case. How do you manage this? I mean,
well, yes. How do you know how to close the screen?
Yes, it's a very small red button next to the green line. It says stop sharing.
Yeah,
you have a green line in
the upper part of the screen.
It can be in the upper or
in the edge, in the upper edge.
Oh yes, I see it. I see it. So I click on. Okay. So
there you go.
Okay, good.
There you go.
Andres.
Yeah, no,
yes, so the question was what?
About the topical medication, cyclosporine, anti-allergic. What is your option when you have to treat this kind of patient?
Well, again, the first thing is to identify the cause of rubbing. So sometimes it's dry eye. Most of the time it's allergy. Many times I believe that keratoconus is caused by a poor sleeping habit, especially unilateral cases. So all this you have to ask: how do you sleep? How do you rub your eyes? Demonstrate it to me. When you have the fullest picture of the full picture, what you can do is fight everything, like sleep position, change it. Not easy. If the eye is dry or is felt dry, hydrated, give like hyaluronic acid, tears you like. If there's an inflammatory dimension, you can use also steroids. You can use cyclosporine in some cases where dry eye or atopy is severe. Send the patient to the dermatologist or to the allergy specialist to have a kind of a comprehensive management of the allergy. Everything which is fighting eye rubbing should be considered, I think.
Perfect.
Diego, you have some question?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Gatinel, Diego from La Paz, Bolivia. And I have practice basis on a city that is 3,060 meters above the level C.
Yeah, a lot of keratoconus.
Yes. And my question is, I am totally agree that eye rubbing is an important part of the development of keratoconus, and but there was hypothesis that UV exposure, UV light exposure, is another thing that it could happens on the cornea, stress, oxidative stress there. Here in La Paz, there are areas with higher than 11 UV index. That is the higher level in the scale. So what's your opinion about that? What's happening in the high altitude, or is there an ethnic part of the problem too?
Could be a mixture of ethnic, if the cornea is thin or softer to start with. Could be also dry air. In altitude usually comes dry air. So dry air, wind,
dust.
Yes, dust. In Europe, I mean, close to Europe, Northern Africa, or the Mediterranean coast is an area where we find a lot of keratoconus. In Northern Africa, corneas are thinner genetically, and there's sun, wind, so specific weather condition, which probably explain also why people rub more their eye. In the Middle East, same. Wind, dryness of the air, like in La Paz, probably for different reasons, but you know, that makes the ocular surface desiccated more than in territories where the moisture of the atmosphere is higher, where there's less. Also, maybe you have a lot of allergens there. If you have some plants, specific species of flowers, trees, plants, that may also explain that patients would be more prone to allergy, etc.
But do you think that UV light is have to is part of the problem?
Part of the problem, what?
The UV light exposure, the high UV light.
The UV light exposure. No, yes, okay. People say UV light is helping cross-linking, and then the cornea would be stiffer over time. That would be one explanation to the fact that we don't see many keratoconus in the older population. I would believe that the UV is more detrimental than beneficial for the cornea. I use the UV example not for keratoconus, but for the sunburn analogy to explain the role of eye rubbing to the cornea. I'm not saying that UV light is bad for the cornea or good for the cornea. It's something different. I don't know, in fact, for UV light. It would be interesting. There could be some impact, but I would bet it's a negative impact more than a positive one.
Yeah, sure. I have a comment because Diego was talking about La Paz. Yes, I'm very close here. As you know, in Ecuador, we also have cities in the altitude. But if we analyze these with the Middle East, they do have keratoconus as well, and they don't have altitude, and it's another completely different weather around there. So sometimes we read something about atmospherical pressure. I don't know if you have read or because you have altitude and you have like in sea level cities, and both of them with the same kind of keratoconus. Here in Ecuador, we have keratoconus in our clinics is a lot. And I don't know if you read something about the atmospheric pressure. Another comment is that we found when we start making tomographies in all our patients with a topical problem, we make a correlation with some changes with if they are lefties or they are righties. Sometimes when you are righty, you have like your arm is stronger than the lefty. And sometimes at the beginning, you will see some changes in one eye and than in another. And we start looking about if they are right-handed or left-handed, and we found some weird things that I don't know if you paid attention to these vectors or weird things.
Yeah. Of course, everything which is keratoconus is very asymmetrical between eyes. And usually it is explained by the difference in the intensity of the rubbing, the end dominance, etc. But this is like a little story you have to make with each patient. Sometimes you find no explanation, but most of the time when keratoconus is more in one eye, it's because of the hand dominance or because they push more with that, or they use the knuckles for one eye and more the pulp for the other one. You can find explanation like that.
Yeah, we found this because we have like some patients that were lefties, and coincident, these patients have more ectatic problems in the left eye. So when we start looking at this in lefties, that, as you know, we are not too much lefties around here. But when we start like making a relation between them, and we found this. And at the moment that we start making all these tomographies in patients with atopic and asking them if they are right-handed and left-handed, we just see some of these changes. Maybe it could be.
But ask them also how they sleep.
Damien, what about, we have a good friend here that he says that every time he puts a segment, an intracorneal segment, keratoconus stops, but not because of the segment, because the person is afraid and he's not rubbing it.
Probably true, like cross-linking maybe, yes.
I think that the best treatment after rings is when you say to the patient that the ring is breakable. So if he rubs his eye, the ring is going to be he can break the ring and maybe stop rubbing.
Damien, so we know you have to go.
Yeah, I have another meeting.
We can't thank you enough. There is a lot of people here in Spanish, but saying that they're convinced and they agree with you. That's a good thing.
Muy bien, muy bien.
And the second thing, is they're asking already for volume 2. So let's hope we have you again in a couple of weeks, because people, there's a lot of questions. Maybe another session, to more interactive, because there is so many.
Sure. Maybe people can come with their topography and their conclusions.
Okay, let's do that. We have your word live, right? Thank you so much. I think we can summarize this as thinking beyond the obvious. We are all about that, that phrase. I think you're exactly doing that. Sometimes it's hard to, when you have established paradigm, it's hard to fight it. But I think there's a lot of people who are open-minded and they really like your theory. I'm one of them. So thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. And
bye-bye. Take care.
I hope to visit you.
You're also invited to Uruguay in December. I hope everything is fine and we can have good wines there.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Bye. Take care. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.